So, we're here on the 17th of November 2021, and we're going to speak to Mum about a bit of family history, her family history. So, maybe we could start talking about I suppose the generations prior to your parents. Just have a bit of background on the grandparents' families. So first of all, perhaps let's start with Granny Scott.
Well, Granny Scott was born Helen Dawson Broadhead in 1894, and she lived at 17 Langholm Crescent with her parents, and I know that her mother stayed there for the rest of her life. It was the only one house she lived in. She lived in as a child, and then when she was married, and then when she was widowed, she there.
Yes, and her surname was?
Frances Dawson.
Yes, that was her mother's surname. That was
Granny Scott's mother, yes.
Yes.
My grandmother.
So she was a Dawson, and her father was James Broadhead, sorry, yes. And he was born in, when was he born? Do you recall?
About 1865, I think. About the same time. Granny was born in 1865.
Yeah.
Frances Dawson was born then.
Okay. And the your granny died in 1952, seems to.
Yes, that seems to fit in.
And your grandfather had died by the time you were born.
Yes, in the 1930s. Yes.
Yeah. So, do you have any recollections of your granny?
Oh yes, I do. She was small. She was only about 5 feet tall. She had white hair. She'd have it in a bun at the back, and she was sort of a very gentle person.
Yeah.
I think at one point, before I went away to school, I used to, on Saturday mornings, go on my bike down to her house and go and collect her bread from the local bakery. And so she gave me a wicker basket to fit on the front of my bike so I could put the loaf of bread in.
Well, that's a nice story.
Yeah.
And what was she like? What was her personality like?
I can't really remember that because I was a child. I was only about 14 when she died. 13, 14, so I can't. She just seemed to me a very gentle person. She was a great baker, actually. She used to make lovely rock buns.
Right.
That we used to enjoy when we went down. But our greatest joy when we went to see her in Langholm Crescent, my sister and I would go to the attic where there's some old trunks that were cabin trunks that had rounded tops.
Yeah.
So we could play leapfrog over them.
All right. And what was the house like? Was it
it was a terrace. It was a crescent, and it was curved like that, and they were about halfway along, numbers 15.
Right. Sounds quite, it was a curved terrace, sort of 2 stories, 3 stories.
There was an attic, so I suppose it was 3 stories. Yes.
Yeah. And what had your grandfather done? Do you know?
Yes, he worked, I think, as a clerk or something like that, for Pease and Partners, who were the Quakers.
Yeah.
Like he was, and what exactly he did there, I don't know. I think he just worked in the office and everything.
I think his clerks in those days were more than perhaps the way that we think about clerks,
yes.
aren't they? They were sort of educated and.
Well, if he could afford to send his children away to school,
yeah,
he must have had a reasonable amount. But by that time, of course, his granny's mother had died, and so they probably inherited some money. I'm not saying it was a lot, but obviously Granny, she was an only child, so she inherited the house when both her parents died. So when she married, my grandfather obviously moved in.
And what was her family background? They were Quakers too.
Who? Granny? No.
Yes.
No, because she was, I don't know, but I think I found a link somewhere in the book that someone got married in the Methodist church, which I think was her, no, which perhaps James Broadhead's mother got married, I think, in a Methodist church at Beeston in Leeds.
Oh, right, okay.
Mm.
So who were the Quakers on that side? That was
Quakers were the Broadheads.
right.
Oh, what were they? Or the Dawsons? I can't remember which side it was.
No, but obviously your mother became a Quaker.
Yes, I think it was probably the Broadheads, because that would be my grandfather's name, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And yes.
Okay. So her family were relatively wealthy. Well, not wealthy, but you know.
Comfortable.
Yeah, comfortable.
Mm.
Okay. And then he worked at a Quaker company, as you said, as a clerk.
Peas and Co.
Peas and Co. What did Peas and Co. do? Do you know?
I think they were stockbrokers. I'm not sure.
Oh, right. Okay.
I'm not sure, something like that.
And that was in Darlington.
Yes, but there were. I mean, Darlington was known as a Quaker town.
Yeah.
There were a lot of Quakers, and some of them were quite well off. Well, one of the Peases, I think, had the public library built. You know, they
Right,
do
yeah.
sort of good works like that.
Yeah.
They also, the Quakers, owned a bank, which I think became Martin's Bank and then became Barclays, didn't it?
Yeah.
But it was called Backhouses. That
Right.
was the name, because that was another big Quaker name in Darlington.
Yeah.
And that's why I think there was such a big meeting house built. It was Georgian and was a good size, with a good sized graveyard behind it,
Yeah.
which I've been to.
So was Granny Scott quite a religious person, or
No, not really.
no? But she would go to the Quaker meetings.
Yes. Mm.
What other sort of interest did Granny Scott have? Do you?
She was a very good embroiderer.
Yeah.
You know, she'd always have something on the go, a cushion cover or,
Yeah.
you know, or something like that.
And she was quite educated.
Well, yes, she could speak French to the end of her life, because I think after her sister was born, Frances Mary, there was about a 14-year gap.
Yeah.
And so I think that's perhaps why they sent her to Switzerland for a year to school.
Yeah. Which seems very sort of upper class, but
No, well, I don't know. I mean,
especially at that time.
yeah.
So that was pre-First World War.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, because Granny Scott was born in 1894. Yeah.
So it'd be about 104, 1908, say that. I think Auntie Mary was born, her sister.
Yeah.
And so that's probably about that time that she would go to Switzerland. She went to Bern and she spent nearly a year there, and she learnt to speak French, and she could speak French to the end of her life.
Yeah. And how many other siblings? There was Mary and a brother?
Heath,
John Heath, yeah.
yes.
And do you have any recollections?
By the time I came on the scene, he lived in Wolverhampton, and he had a practice there as a dentist, and he married someone called Alice,
Right.
who was very unpopular in the family.
Oh, right. For any particular reason?
I think they just didn't like her, and she wasn't. I think the story goes that how, and it proves that she perhaps wasn't very kind to her mother-in-law, my granny.
Right. Okay.
But then there was a fearful row when Granny died, and Grandpa and Auntie Mary's husband were executors of the will, and the will stated it was to be divided between the two girls, because John Heath, they bought him, as you did in those days, a practice, you know, for the dentist. Well, Alice didn't like that. But
yeah.
she felt that was unfair, had nothing to do with her really. And but my father and uncle just said, well, you know, it's written here, there's nothing we can do about it. This is what, you know,
Yes.
we
Yeah.
wanted. So after that they didn't speak for years.
Oh dear.
But I know that Auntie Mary, her side of the family, did make it up with him,
Right.
but I don't think my mother ever did.
Right. And what do you remember of your Auntie Mary?
Well, she lived to be about 96 or something, and and she was smallish again, and she had slightly reddish hair, and she would always, she had a funny laugh. I can sort of remember how she used to laugh sometimes.
And did she live in Darlington too?
No, they lived in the Harrogate area.
And did we ever meet them? Because she, I suppose, was still alive about the time they were born?
Yes, she was. She died after. Well, there was a 14-year gap. I mean, Mother was 88 and Auntie Mary was about 96 when she died.
Ah, right, okay.
You know, so there was quite a gap. But they did at one point. I mean, I used to keep in touch with Auntie Mary because she was actually, we'd been christened, and she was my godmother.
Yeah.
Or one of my godmothers.
And you have cousins?
Yes. Margaret and James.
Yeah.
But there had been, after Margaret, a little boy being born, John. But I never found out what was the matter with him, whether he had a congenital heart defect or something like that. But they knew he wouldn't live long, and he lived till he was about 6, and then he died.
Right.
And then they decided to have another child. So they did, and that's James, my cousin James.
Who's still alive?
Oh yes, he's still alive. I see him. He lives up in Cumbria. When I came here.
Yeah. Have we, I mean, I've never met him, but has Emma met him? Or?
Yeah, I know he and Margaret came to Dad's funeral.
Right, well, yeah.
Mm.
So, and obviously he was involved in the chairs, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
But also, Margaret was your godmother.
Yes.
And so kept in touch, but I did feel as we got older that we perhaps grew apart with different ideas. And
She was a strange woman though, wasn't
yes,
she?
She was rather.
With the funeral and, what was the funeral?
No, it was family only, and so I couldn't go.
And that was whose funeral?
That was Auntie Mary's funeral. Margaret's mother.
Funny, yeah. Yeah, and when would that have been? That would have been...
Ooh, that's not so long ago. 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I remember.
Yes, so Margaret, obviously your cousin, James, your cousins from that side, but on John Heath's side, no cousins.
There weren't any children, partly because Alice was a diabetic.
Right, okay.
Which it isn't easy to have a child then, if you do, you know. Anyway.
So when you were children, did you see quite a lot of Margaret and James?
Yes, a reasonable amount, yes.
But they lived in Harrogate? Yeah.
Yes, well they'd come over to Darlington, say, and they couldn't do it. I can remember I came halfway between James and Margaret, and so there was James, 5 years older was me, 5 years older was Margaret, and about 3 years Francis came between the 4 of us.
Yeah.
And we used to go and see someone called Auntie Constance really, but I don't know what the relationship was, and we would be, the 4 of us, told to go. Well, James being younger was put in a pushchair, and we'd take him. We'd all be a bit silly, I think. We were just sort of within a quarter of a mile, I should think we were quite capable of going.
Let's just switch then. Okay, so we've got the sort of 2 generations back, and obviously we've got the family tree, which we can look at further. But obviously your memories don't go beyond your own living memories and what's been passed to you. But did on Grandpa Scott's side, so he was born in 1881, which just is incredible, isn't it? Nearly 150 years, well, 140 years ago. And he was born in Darlington.
No.
No?
He was born in Witton-le-Weir.
Right, okay. And you were born in Durham, of course, weren't you?
I was born in Darlington.
Oh, you were born in Darlington?
Yes.
Why do I always think you were born in Durham? Or it's the county of Durham, isn't it? I suppose
Yes,
that's right.
that's it.
You were born in Darlington. So Grandpa Scott was born in 1881, and his parents were Peter.
And we think Mary Ann.
Mary Ann, yeah.
But you can check that with
and obviously they were deceased by the time you were born.
But of course some of Grandpa's brothers, although he was, I think, the youngest of the 8, I can remember one of his sister, Auntie Eva, who lived up Arkengarthdale, and I can also remember Auntie Dora, who lived there. One lived in the big house and one lived in a little cottage. That's how I worked
So those
out.
were his sisters?
Those were, yeah, but he had more sisters, you see.
How many siblings did he have?
Well, you see, if he was the youngest of 8, there were 7.
He was, yes.
There's one called Henry, who I don't remember. There's one called Uncle George, who weighed about 17 stone, and we always went to see him on Christmas Day. And he was really nice, he was jolly. I can remember that. And then there was, there were 2 sisters, and George, and there must have been some more, but they were probably dead by the time I was born, because they'd be so much older than Grandpa.
Yeah.
And you've got to remember that Grandpa Scott was, about 56 when I was born.
Yeah, I mean, he was in his late 50s.
Yes.
Mid-50s at least,
Yes.
yeah.
So that it's not surprising. I didn't know many.
No, especially in those days when people obviously did die could die relatively young from relatively what are now minor infections. Yeah. So he was. So did he give you much? What about his parents? Did he?
Who? Peter.
No, Grandpa Scott's parents.
Oh, which
so
was
Peter Scott and Mary Ann. Yeah.
No, he didn't. I think David's got an odd photo and things of the family.
And were they sort of working class in Darlington?
Yes. No, in Witton-le-Weir.
In Witton-le-Weir, sorry. Do you know what they did? What his father?
Well, I said that Peter was a groom at Witton Castle. And I don't think that Mary Ann worked. She'd be quite busy with such a big family.
Yeah. But Grandpa Scott obviously was educated to a pretty good
Well,
level.
yes, he was clever. He won a scholarship to, I think it was Hampstead Grammar School or some grammar school in the area, but they couldn't afford the uniform, so he couldn't go.
Yeah.
And that often happened.
It's astonishing, isn't it, really?
This
For want
day.
of a uniform, you were sort of held back. And, okay, so, but he did get a good education.
Well, he went on to village school, I suppose,
Yeah.
till he was about 14. And while he was at school, the firm he eventually worked for, North Bitchburn, he used to go and collect their post and take it to the post office for them while he was still at school.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing, isn't it? That.
And then when he left school, he went in as the office boy.
Yeah.
And when he was in his 80s and retired, he was director and company secretary.
Yeah. It's an amazing career.
With one firm.
Yeah, with one firm where he basically started at the bottom and ended up on the board as a secretary, I suppose.
The people who were the biggest, say, shareholders in North Bitchburn was a family called Mounsey.
Right.
Mounsey were Quakers again, Darlington.
But Grandpa Scott wasn't a Quaker.
No.
Okay.
I think, I've no proof of this, but I think my mother said to me at one point that before they married, they said if they had boys, they would follow the father's religion, they would become Anglican, and if they were girls, they'd follow the mother's. Because I think Granny Scott said that's what they used to do on the continent, which seemed a good way really of deciding it. But there are only 2 girls.
And when he was born in 1881. I mean, do you have any other sort of family recollections of your sort of aunties and uncles? Any?
Well, Auntie Dora, yes, we used to go and stay with for a few days in the summer holidays.
And that was up in
Arkengarthdale.
Right, yeah.
And I think during the war once, for a summer break, we went to stay with our parents as well, with Auntie Eva at Escliffe Hall, which I've seen, but now I know Francis has been back. The ruins, it was burnt down.
And it was a hall?
It was a hall, Escliffe Hall, and a farm.
Right, so fairly substantial.
Yes, Auntie Eva had married originally a solicitor, and then she married this rich farmer, but Auntie Dora just had a wool shop and things. You know, it was there was quite a bit of social distance.
Yes, yeah. I suppose they came from relatively humble beginnings, but sort of had mixed, I mean, obviously marriages, but also careers in terms of your. And did he have any brothers?
Yes.
Yeah. How many of his were brothers do you recall?
Well, I only remember Uncle George.
Yeah.
And
The big guy.
Yes, who weighed about 17
And he
stone.
was very jolly. So it sounds like it was a relatively big, sort of happy family.
Yes.
Were there good relationships?
Yes. We used to go and see someone in Witten-le-Weir, a lady who I think was a niece of Dad's or something like that, to some relation. I can't even remember her name, but she still lived at Witten, and we'd about once a year go up there and see her.
And so Grandpa Scott, born in 1881, started working obviously when he was, I imagine, about 14.
Yeah.
In Darlington
Well, no, first of all in Witten.
In Witten.
But then they moved the firm to Darlington.
Yeah.
And then at one point, much later, it split because they were mining coal as well as pipeclay.
Right, okay.
And of course, it was nationalised, the coal.
Oh, in the war, yeah.
After the war, or during the war.
But that was, yes, I suppose, quite late on in his career. Okay, so but it was a fairly substantial company.
Yes, at one point, yes.
Yeah, so he must have been a fairly important figure as company secretary, which he ended up.
Yeah, I think he was quite clever mentally and with sums and things like that. I mean, the story goes that once he bought some shares.
Yes.
And then they sold it to him at the wrong price. And he said, but you sold them to me. And they wanted their money back and wanted him to buy them at the price they should have given him. And he wouldn't.
No.
And so they would never trade with him again.
No. Well, fair enough.
Yes.
Fair enough, yeah. I mean, if you're going to buy them at a price, you can't then go back on it once you receive the money.
You're not going to give it back.
Okay, but he was obviously clever, and when we were young, I mean, I remember him always being very smart. He always seemed to be wearing a three-piece tweed suit.
Yes.
And his hair was always very well sort of combed.
Plastered down. And he always had lots of hair, didn't he?
And he the flat was always very tidy, wasn't it? And I remember him, as I say, peeling apples in such a sort of careful, smart way. Yeah, he didn't.
You all used to look at him in amazement.
I know. Transfixed by his peeling.
Yeah.
And also he'd read the paper but obviously when we knew him, he was well into his 80s, wasn't he? And but yeah, very gentle and quiet. I don't recall it being.
He was quite strict as a father, though.
Yeah.
I think because that was the Victorian part of it, perhaps coming.
Yeah, well, this comes out more and more, doesn't it?
Yes.
But he didn't seem austere or anything like that. Just
I think he's
quiet
sort of,
and sort of smart.
Yes.
But so he was working, and then obviously, I suppose the major event of his relatively young life was the First World War. So he would have been 33, I think, when the First World War sort of began.
He never fought in either the Boer War, the First World War, or the Second World War. The first two he couldn't do it because of his eyesight.
Yeah.
I don't know what was wrong with his eyesight, but in the First World War he got as far as Aldershot, which was a great sort of army place.
Yeah.
And he was sent home again.
So did he join up or was he conscripted?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think, but he.
And I suppose that must in some ways have been quite difficult for him.
Yes, because they often thought people should go and.
Well, yeah.
Or they were given, what was it, a white feather?
Yeah.
Show you were a coward.
Which is incredible, really, if you think about it. But obviously, there was so much sort of propaganda to join up, and this is going to be very good.
Yes, your country needs you.
And it's going to be really quick, and be over by Christmas, and it'll be a glorious victory. That people did flock to join up, didn't they? But so he didn't, and obviously carried on working during the war, which must have been strange and as you say, quite difficult maybe for to constantly have to be explaining, I suppose, the situation. Well, I did go down to Aldershot and join, but I couldn't. They wouldn't let me in. So
no.
yeah.
So
But I suppose if your eyesight wasn't good, you couldn't really aim a rifle. You know, you couldn't.
Well, wasn't it Kipling who wanted his son to join up, and because of his eyesight, he couldn't see. And of course, he got killed straight away.
Yeah, I mean,
You know.
incredible, really, if you think about that. Yeah.
But no.
Yeah. So he carried on.
He married.
Oh yes.
Now I don't know when he married, and I don't know the name of the person who.
And when did he marry?
I don't know.
But around, you would imagine, around the time of the First World War.
Yes,
when he was
I
in
think
his
so,
30s,
81.
20s, 30s.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think he was quite young when he married.
And do you know what happened?
I know they didn't have any children, and I think he was married for about 28 years.
Oh wow! So it wasn't like a brief marriage
No.
like Dad's that went wrong and.
No, I think in the end she got cancer or something like that.
Right. Okay.
So she died relatively young.
Yeah.
Well, she'd be in her 40s, say.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't realise he'd been widowed.
Yes. No children.
That's new to me, actually. Yeah. Okay, so he was married for some time, obviously prior to marrying Granny Scott, and then he just continued with his career. Was married, and then at some point, she died, and then they married in. When did they actually get married then? In the 1930...
About 35, I think it was.
35, so just prior, obviously, they had Auntie Frances relatively quickly.
Well, if they married in August 35, and she was born in December 36.
So Granny Scott was already 40, she was born in 1894.
Yes.
So she would have been 32. Oh, sorry, 42.
Yes.
So fortunate in some ways, you know, prior to obviously IVF.
Yes.
Fortunate to have children.
Yes.
And 2 children. Yeah.
I mean, Grandpa once said to me, Dad once said to me, I never thought I'd marry again. I never thought I'd have children. And then he said, and I never thought I'd see my grandchildren.
Yeah, wow. So he was in his mid-50s, she was in her early 40s.
Yeah, there's 14 years difference.
Yeah. They had children. So do you know how they met?
Well, at one point, he lived next door to them, in Langholm Crescent.
And probably with his wife.
I just don't know whether he was widowed by then or not.
No.
But she could have been.
But your mum could well have known his first wife.
She could have.
Who was
never talked about it.
Who was obviously quite a bit older, if she was a similar age to Grandpa Scott.
Yes. Yeah.
So they were neighbours.
At one point.
She was living with her parents, I'm assuming, yes. And he was,
Granny.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he was obviously living with his wife or by himself afterwards. And do you know how they sort of started courting, or?
No, I don't.
They never spoke about that.
No. She said that, Granny said that Grandpa proposed to her at the top of Honiton Pass in the Lake District.
Oh, how romantic. So how were they getting there? Did he have a car?
Oh, yes, he had a car, yes.
So he had a car, and obviously at that point he was in his 50s. He made a success of his career. So he bought a car, was, you know, comfortable.
He bought a house as well.
Yeah, so comfortably sort of middle class.
Yes.
Sort of lifestyle. Did he have any sort of? He didn't strike me as somebody who had any sort of airs or graces.
No. He still had a bit of a Durham accent, didn't he?
Yes. Yeah. Thinking about it.
Different expressions. Yes.
Yeah. So he was obviously a good match, and they got married and had 2 children. And what are your sort of early recollections of childhood? Do you remember the house?
Yes, I do. I remember the house and the garden. I once pulled up all Father's onions and he spanked me for it.
Oh, really?
Don't blame him when looking back, you know, but it's been a bit annoying. Yes, he loved it. He had a big vegetable patch.
Right.
And he had soft fruit. I remember my mother used to give us a basin, and either fill that with gooseberries or raspberries or whatever was going, and she'd make jam. You've got to remember it was the wartime, so
Yeah.
they'd want to do that.
He obviously enjoyed his fruit with his apples when we used to go and see.
Yes, I suppose he did. But when he got strawberries, and he always mashed them up with a fork.
Right, okay.
I don't know why, but he did.
It's just
He
his
spoiled
way,
them.
yeah.
No, do you remember that?
I don't remember us having strawberries there, but I do. I just remember the apple sort of thing. It was funny, I was in an antique shop, you know, the one we went to in Crouch Street.
Yes.
And she had a collection of, I thought they were pen knives. I just don't know, those are
fruit knives.
Fruit knives, yeah.
Mm.
But yeah, he was, yeah, that's what I recall him. I can really see him now very clearly in his tweed suit, very
His
sort
tie.
of smart.
Mm.
So you were brought up, and how big was the house? It was a sort of
It was
3-4 beds?
it was 4 beds. It was a 1930 semi. It was a good size.
Mm.
It had an old-fashioned sort of range, funny enough, in the kitchen,
Yeah,
and it had a pantry and a scullery,
yeah.
and a loo next to the back door.
And it was a stone house. I think
No,
I
it was
asked
brick.
you,
It was
actually.
brick. I've got photos somewhere.
Yeah, I think when I was in Darlington years ago, I took the time to sort of find it. I think, but okay. So you had a nice garden, and obviously you had your sister Frances.
It was a big garden because in the centre of this there was a house, a large house that had been divided into 3 houses, and round it was a road that went round. I forget what it was called, but all the locals called it the Circle. And it so happened that our side gate opened onto the Circle. But just beyond that there was the vegetable patch, and it ran behind our next door neighbour's garden, which was very small now, because Grandpa bought that plot of land which they would have built another house on.
Right.
He bought it so that they had a bigger garden.
Right. Okay. And I suppose during the war it was useful to have a
Oh,
good
yes.
garden. Yeah.
Yes, he grew a lot of vegetables.
Yeah.
Mm.
So Auntie Frances being 2 years older than you,
14 months.
14 months. So you were obviously very close in age.
Yes.
And do you have any sort of memories of the two of you? You know, when you were young, was it a happy home? Do you think?
Yes, I think it was really. I think in some ways it was quite strict with them being older.
Yeah.
I know he used to make us go to bed so early, and because just couldn't sleep when it was daytime.
Yeah.
And I can remember sort of looking out between the curtains,
Yeah.
and Father was down there, and he was talking to our next door neighbour, Mr. Ventris, and Mr. Ventris said, "Look up there," and he came up and spanked me for looking out of the window.
Yeah. Yeah. So you'd be punished, sort of.
Yes. I mean, Mother, if we'd done something wrong, would say, "Hold out your hand." You'd hold out your hand like this, and she'd just sting for, you know, it would sting for
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
couple of minutes.
But that was the norm, wasn't it?
Oh,
I
yes,
suppose?
yes. It wasn't as though...
Yeah.
I mean, I think the worst thing I did was, you know, pull up the onions.
Yeah. So how would you describe your mother and father? How would you describe each of them and their relationship?
You mean their relationship to me?
No. How would you describe each of them? How would you describe your mother? What words would you use to?
Oh, golly, I just don't know.
Well, was she kind? Was she
Oh, yes, she wasn't unkind. They were, both of them were quite strict.
strict? Yeah.
And I think sort of, I don't think perhaps they'd realised when they were in the 40s and 50s having 2 children, especially say until we went away to school. And I sometimes wonder if we went away to school to give them a little bit of a rest,
Yeah.
you know, free from it. I don't know about that because Mother went away to school, went to Ackworth, and so did her father, my grandfather, and I think they just
Yeah.
sort of followed on with us.
But was your father funny? Were they, you know, how would you describe? So strict obviously is one, but I mean, I remember you being strict when I was really young, thinking that you were really strict.
Well, maybe because they were strict, you often follow your parents.
Yeah,
and
you do.
What they did.
But how else would you describe them? Could you?
I think they were loving in their own way.
Yeah.
They weren't very demonstrative,
No.
say like that. But
They were both quite gentle people, weren't they?
Oh yes, there was no violence or anything like that in that. I mean,
No.
you can't blame him with the onions. It must have been a bit.
Yeah.
And Granny sort of smacking your hand for doing something well.
And do you think they had a good relationship?
Yes, I do actually. I think my mother really loved my father, and I can remember her. She used to sometimes, a bit to annoy him, I think, and she'd go around, she'd sort of sing, there's a song called Charlie is my darling, my darling, my darling, Charlie is my darling, the young cavalier, or whatever it is.
Right.
And she'd go around humming that, and he'd sort of say, shut up,
Oh, really? So a bit of a fun, yeah.
Yeah.
That's nice. And how would you describe him? As I say, I remember him being sort of quiet and gentle and smart.
Yes, he's had sort of fixed ideas about, say, politics and things like that. He was very much. We used to have a huge picture at home of a huntsman and things, and underneath it said, presented to C.H. Scott, in sort of thanks for his being treasurer of the Darlington Conservative and Unionist Party for 10 years or something.
Oh, right, okay, so he was a Conservative.
Oh yes, very much a Conservative.
And what about Granny Scott?
I think she just followed on, she was
Yeah.
Conservative. Yes.
I mean, obviously the Quakers came in all different, I suppose. But,
Yes, I think.
but they were pacifists and obviously quite...
Not all of them were, most of them were, but not. You can't sort of rule it out, because then people would think, they were doing it for their country and going to war, although they didn't like killing people. But that's why, the Friends Ambulance Unit was well known in the First World War.
Yeah, so lots went to stretcher bearers.
Yes, they did. They were quite happy to do that.
But generally, I mean, having looked at it very briefly, it was anti-war,
Oh yes.
slavery, anti all kinds of...
They're the ones that said in 1822 at their sort of yearly general meeting that what is let me try and get it what is morally wrong cannot be politically correct.
Yeah.
And that's what they said about slavery.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so obviously, but they were both quite conservatives, I suppose. But you remember it being a happy house. And let's talk about you and Auntie Frances.
Well, I think there's always a bit of rivalry because we were quite close together. There's only 14 months between us.
Yeah.
And she teased me to make me cry. I'm not saying I was particularly nice to her or anything at times like that.
Yeah, but...
She did, and she used to, as a teenager, argue with my mother.
Yeah.
I can remember being upstairs and arguing.
What would they argue about?
I don't know really, but you'd hear them.
Yeah.
I'd just think, oh, get out, I'm in the garden,
That's interesting.
I think Frances was a bit disappointed, and I don't blame her, and I can see it, because when she left school, left the mount, she didn't know what she wanted to do. She would like to have gone to, catering school, but the parents said, no, we've spent enough money on your education. And so, which was a bit hard on her, I think.
Yeah.
And so she went to work just as a clerk at the Weir and Tees River Board.
Right.
It was like the office girls sort of thing, and nothing.
Yeah.
Made the tea and posted the letters sort of thing. And then she did that, whereas I knew I wanted to do nursing, but Father wasn't keen on me to do nursing.
Yeah.
I think I told
But we're jumping ahead. So you obviously were born in 38 and you went to school in Darlington.
We both of us first went to what we used to call a dame school, and it was called Miss Furness's.
Right.
And I think there were only 2 classes, might only have been 20 children or something. But it gave you a good basic running. By the time I left age 6 to go to Poland Hall, I could read and I could do joined up writing. And when I can remember them putting me in a class at Poland Hall, I said, but I can read and I can do joined up writing. So they put me up a class, they put me up a year.
Right, okay.
But I've always been able to read, and I've always liked reading.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, my mother really encouraged us to read.
Yeah. Was Auntie Frances more academic than you, do you think, or?
I don't know, I can't remember what she got for her A-levels.
But
My father was so disappointed, because he felt that she was so quick at maths, mental arithmetic, why she couldn't go on and do something like that. But he didn't realise that there are different types of maths,
Yeah.
and so, you know, she
She's-
probably couldn't.
Yeah, I mean, even speaking to her recently, she's very quick-witted, isn't she? And
she talks very quickly.
yeah, but that represents the speed of her thoughts, doesn't it?
Yes.
But yeah, so, but you got on pretty well. I mean, obviously, like siblings, you'd argue, but
Oh yes.
and you.
What our father used to do, which I said I'd never ever do, what one of us did, the other had to do as well. So Frances wanted to go to dancing classes. I didn't, but I had to go because she wanted to think something.
Was she more outgoing than you, do you think?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I think I could be quite shy and quite. If you asked Rosie, or people say I was quite quiet at school.
Yeah. And when you were in Darlington at the time, your sort of social kind of, what would you be doing as a child in
Not a lot. Our parents didn't entertain. Perhaps at Christmas they might have one or two neighbours
Yeah.
for a drink, you know, for a glass of horrible sherry or something.
And you'd be playing with the local children, or?
When we lived at Benwood, the house, the large 1938 semi,
Yeah.
because of this road, this circular road, and quite a few houses opening on, there were quite a lot of children actually. I think there'd be about 10 or more. There was sort of me and Frances, Gregor Stewart, the Zisler children, the Rogersons, you know, they all
Yeah.
about it.
So you had fun times, did you?
Yes, we enjoyed playing there. I think parents felt we were all quite safe
Yeah.
on the circle, yes.
Yeah. And obviously, you were born in 38, and the war came the year after.
Well, then we went, when war was announced that we was doing, we went up to a place called Milburn, to a farm there owned by the Johnsons, that my grandfather knew this Dr. Fairchild, and he offered us to take us all in, plus Auntie Mary and James and Margaret.
Oh right, so you all lived together.
But only for a short time in this farmhouse.
How
Because
long?
it was like a phony war, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
You know, like they evacuated children quickly and then...
But you were only a very small, you were sort of two or one, two.
Yes.
So how long did you go up for, a year or something?
No, I don't think it was even as long as that.
And then what, you came back to Darlington
yes.
thinking it was relatively safe?
Yes, and it was relatively safe.
Because it was an industrial town, wasn't it?
Yes, it did. I mean, made for building bridges and things.
Yes, I suppose there was a danger there would be some bombing. Even
But
if it was just on the way to Manchester or whatever from the North Sea, I suppose there is a possibility.
Well,
or Leeds.
One plane did drop its bomb. I don't know whether it was coming home or what, and made this huge crater about 5 miles outside Darlington. And everyone went to look at it because we'd never seen a crater.
Yeah.
So,
Interesting.
but father belonged to the ARP.
Right, yes, the air raid was sort of...
Air raid patrol,
Yes,
something like that. Early war.
So they've been looking to make sure that the blackout was done.
Yes, and no fires.
And if there were any bombs, then obviously they would be out on hand to do whatever needed to be done with the emergency services, I suppose.
I can remember plywood being cut to the shape of the window and things would, so that at night they'd put these over certain windows.
Right, okay. Because, I mean, you were only 7, I suppose, when the war finished. But all of those years, really, were during the war, weren't they?
Yes.
Apart from very early.
Yes, because things I didn't realise that it was sort of the war. And when it was Christmas once, and last one, I wanted a dolly. And so this dolly came with its dress sort of all fixed on it and everything. I called it Jennifer. I remember it to this day, and Jennifer came to me. And I was out with my mother, and I'd got Jennifer. And this friend of mother's sort of said, oh, is that your dolly? Is it new? You know, being nice to me, nice. And I can remember my mother saying, such a shame that we can't get her a proper dolly that she could take the clothes on and off. And I thought, but I love my dolly. You know, and it didn't bother me because I never knew about things like that.
No. But have you got any memories of the war? Well, no, obviously that would be during that time, wouldn't
Yes.
it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you were 7 when it finished.
Yes.
More or less. Do you have any sort of memories, any other memories of the wartime?
No, not really. Just blackout, I suppose.
Yeah.
And the car being up on wooden blocks because that take the tyres off.
Oh, really? For the war effort?
Yes, for
Yeah.
all things. And then things improved and we got a petrol allowance to take us to school because Poland was, well, it was within walking distance, but it was quite a long walk. And also it meant that we could take another couple of children who lived in Carmel Road.
Right.
So my father could apply for petrol.
So you were at school, in a local school?
I went to this little tiny school, Miss Furness's, till I was about 6'4" or 6'8", and then I went to Poland Hall. And
was that a private school?
Oh yes, yes.
Right, okay.
Yes, I went to Elm Grove, which was the junior bit, and I was quite happy there. Yes.
So comfortable sort of middle class.
Yes.
Sort of life, and then obviously you would be going to. You went away to another school, didn't you?
Yeah. When I was 11, I went to the Mount, and Francis had gone. No, I didn't. When I was 11, I went to Ackworth.
Yeah.
And Francis was already at Ackworth.
Yeah.
And I didn't like it at all.
What didn't you like?
These strange creatures called boys.
Oh, so it was a mixed school?
It was co-ed, yes.
Oh, right, okay.
It was Quaker school.
But it wasn't, and that was a boarding school?
Yes.
So you were boarding in a, right, that's interesting.
Didn't really like it. And so the arrangement had been that they would, we would go to Ackworth for 2 years and then we'd go on to the Mount. But because I wasn't very happy at Ackworth, and Francis's 2 years were up, being a year ahead, that we both went to the Mount at the same time. I really enjoyed it, but I don't think Francis did as much as I did.
Right.
I don't know why, but perhaps you'd made, you've been 2 years in a school, you've started to make your friends and things.
And what do you remember of the Mount and your time there?
Of what?
What do you remember of the Mount and those years, when you were at school there?
For the 5 years. I really enjoyed it. A bit naughty sometimes with the teachers, I think. And I could have worked harder looking back, but I think most children realise that they could have worked harder if they'd, if they'd done it. But then I made some very good friends. Here we are. I went in 1950 and I'm still seeing, Rosie and Carol and Jane, the 4 of us, we've known each other, for 70 years now.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Always kept in touch. And about the last 20 years, well, not the last recent years, that we used to meet in the summer, and all go around the different places we lived in.
Yeah. And so when you were at York, you were boarding. Were you allowed out of the school?
Oh yes, yeah. They're quite progressive. The amount you could walk to the Micklegate bar so many times a term, but you had to write your name down in a book, and so you could do it. And then in about 1953, I think sweets came off rationing, so we went to the sweet shop then. We had pocket money, so much.
Yeah. And how would you do? So was it a Quaker school?
Yes.
And what was the atmosphere like there? It sounds like you had, it was fun.
I did have quite a good time. Yes, I do. I think, like I say, I could have worked harder. I don't think the teachers were the best. I think at that point it wasn't particularly academic. But having said that, I was at school with Margaret Drabble and A.S. Byatt.
Oh, wow.
So, they were obviously quite good, because I think there was a really good English teacher.
Margaret Drabble and A.S. Byatt. And Judy Dench.
And Judy Dench. It was quite...
Yeah. it's quite a cohort, isn't it?
Yes.
Were they all in sort of the years around you?
Well, Judy Dench was, I should think, about perhaps 4 years ahead of me. And then Margaret Drabble was the same year as me.
Yeah.
And I think 2 or 3 years ahead of me would be A.S. Ballard Susan.
Yeah, wow. So you studied there. And what did you enjoy studying? What were your best subjects?
History.
Yes, history.
I think partly because of the teacher, Miss Nicholson, who was Irish, and she used to sit on the teacher's desk and sort of swing her legs, and she'd come up as though she was just telling you a story.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. Rosie will tell you absolutely the opposite.
Yeah.
She didn't enjoy it at all, and she didn't appreciate it. And the other thing I liked was domestic science, cooking and so on.
Yeah.
English I was absolutely hopeless at. I never passed English O-level, English language.
But yet you enjoy reading so much.
I know. Peter just used to say there's a kink up there.
Well, I think there's possibly something in that, isn't it? But maybe, yeah, who knows? Yeah.
I mean, I can remember my mother laughing at a letter I sent home saying something, my new laced shoes. Well, how would you spell laced? How do you spell it?
Well, L-A-C-E-D.
No, you don't. You spell it L-A-I-S-T. You can see how I get there phonetically.
Yeah.
So I couldn't. It's like when I left school and I went to fill in time before nursing, I went to a secretarial college, which we were talking about last time, and on Friday afternoons it was spelling. I always used to skip Friday afternoons because I knew I was so hopeless.
Yeah. So when you were at school, you started to think, obviously in latter years, what you were going to do.
Yeah. Well, quite early on I'd said that I wanted to be a nurse. I don't know what made me. I think from when I was about 9 or 10 I decided.
Oh, right, so quite early on you had a calling.
Well, I just felt it was me. I mean,
Yeah.
perhaps I'd read something or,
who
or
knows?
seen something on television.
But something planted the seed. And so you finished and you went and did a secretarial course, you said.
Oh gosh, I must go and take my tablet.
Okay, well we'll stop there.
Could have
shall we?
taken it at 11.